This happened back in the fall of 2015. So, to give you a little bit of backstory, I live in a smaller house out in the countryside, and because electricity is very expensive, at least the PUD around here is, I mainly rely on a wood stove during the wintertime. I mean, hell, it heats the house up a lot more efficiently than electric heaters, and a cord of wood cost me a lot less money. So, luckily for me, my family has a really good connection with a fellow who lives up in the mountains that I go and cut down my own wood every fall and winter. I won't be referring to his actual name in the story, just to protect his identity, so I'll refer to him as Ken. So Ken has been a longtime family friend of ours, and owns about 50 to 60 acres up in the mountains, where he too has a small trailer. Luckily for him, there's a lot of beautiful deer and elk that roam around, and lots of dead trees, which means perfect for cutting up firewood. A lot of the dead trees have been dead for quite some time, usually due to a kind of rot or bacteria, and there's a lot of dead standing trees that still have yet to be cut down. Last time I was up there, which was just about 3 or 4 months ago, there was easily more than 50 last I checked, and I only need a few for wintertime. So, the usual process is, I go up there, take my trusty chainsaw, cut down about 3 or 4, cut the rounds up, load them into my pickup truck, and then I go split them by hand. And there you go. I get a few cords for the winter and I'm set. So this particular fall was not unlike any other. I did the usual. Went up there, went to a dead standing tree, and began my process of felling it. That's when I began hearing strange noises off in the distance, over my chainsaw. I actually had to stop my cutting and look over, because I couldn't quite make out what was going on. It sounded like a screaming match, or some sort of wrestling brawl, between 2 alpha male primal apes. I guess that's the best I can describe it. It sounded loud, and in my line of sight, I could visibly see the trees shaking off in the distance, over a small valley that lay just between me and this ruckus. I was kind of wondering, what animals out here could possibly do that? We're in the middle of nowhere, and there are certainly no zoos anywhere, if not for hundreds of miles, nor are there really much other people, so there's no reason at all why I should be hearing a noise like this, and deers and elk certainly don't make this kind of noise. So I stopped my chainsaw, set it down, and just sat and observed. The screaming and fighting got louder. It sounded like 2 hippopotamuses or 2 gorillas having a massive fight. It was so loud. And whatever they were, whatever animals they were, had to have been big and powerful, because the trees were shaking violently. Although the brush was still too thick from that distance, I could see the tops of the trees shaking violently. This went on for about 5 or 10 minutes, when it stopped just as suddenly as it began. I tried to ignore it, and finished felling this dead standing tree. Once I had it felled, I began cutting off and lopping off the branches, then splitting it into 12-inch rounds. I got about halfway through the tree when the noises started up again, only this time much closer to me, and to my right versus directly in front of me. Although this time, it didn't sound like a brawl as much as it did them running through the forest in my direction. Here, let me paint a better picture for you. Picture a linebacker from a football team. Make him about triple in size, so maybe 13 feet tall. Make him about 6 to 7 feet wide, rippling muscles, an actual giant. Now, make him as thick as steel, and have him barrel through the woods. Now imagine that coming at you, at roughly 20 miles an hour. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could see the trees moving, coming closer to me, and I could certainly hear something big was coming in my direction. I wasn't exactly sure what to think, so I sat there with my chainsaw. My entire body at this point was screaming to leave, but I didn't want to leave without wood, so I put my chainsaw down just in case I needed to bolt, got ready to get in a runner's stance, in case whatever this was showed itself, and continued to pursue me aggressively. But just in that moment, whatever was charging directly at me through the trees, took a right turn and bolted off to the right of me again and circled all the way around me in the woods, as if it knew to stay and remain hidden and not come out in the clearing. I could hear this thing coming all the way around me, directly to my right, working its way all the way directly behind me, and then to my left, all the way to my left, and then disappearing and running off further into the woods. There is a large clearing where I was. Even though it was scattered with dead standing trees, it was large enough that if anything were to come through, you would visibly be able to see it. Ken keeps plenty of salt licks around, as to attract deer and elk, and boy, do they come in numbers. I've seen many before, so initially, that's what I thought it was. But the sounds just didn't match up. It didn't sound like hooves. It sounded again like a big gorilla stomping around. Only problem is, up here in North America, we have no wild gorillas of that size or stature out in the wild. And whatever it was intelligent enough to know to stay hidden, that there was a clearing coming up, and it remained to stay just far enough into the woodline where I could not see it. But I could certainly see it, and the trees continued to move, bend, and shake all the way around as it worked its way in a matter of seconds. Another astonishing feat is that the brush that it went through is quite thick. These are small trees densely packed together. I mean, after all, the timber is pretty small, but it's very thick. And to wade through at the speed it did, with that size, must mean it must have considerable power. That was more than enough for me. I just said, okay, I'm done. Quickly loaded the few rounds that I had into my truck, put my chainsaw back. That's when I drove up to Ken's house, knocked on his door, but I guess he had left, and I didn't even notice. So I got in my truck, got out of there. It's about an hour and 20 minutes back to my house. I just salvaged what rounds that I had at the time, and split those up. I would come back at a future date. About the next day or so, I gave Ken a phone call, and told him that I had an experience up there, and I proceeded to tell him exactly what I just told you. Well, Ken and I have never talked about this topic ever before until this phone call. He got really quiet, and before I even told him, I was paranoid he wasn't going to believe me, think of me as a liar, and lose respect. But he quietly told me, he knows, that he's seen these things around before on the property. He said there's multiple of them, and they all linger around. In fact, that night, I guess one of them had nearly ripped the door off his trailer, and the other one had left a massive dent as it ran straight into his trailer. They'll also come onto his property, move things around, misplace things, break stuff. One time, they took one of his splitting mauls and broke it in half like it was a toothpick. Mind you, it was a heavy-duty splitting maul, made of metal and steel. How they did that or what they are, I don't exactly know. Over the phone conversation, we never actually discussed what they were, but we discussed there were something, and whatever kind of animals they are, they don't like people coming on the property. The weird thing is, I've been going up there for years, and have never had an experience like that until that fall. The falls following after that, they remained more quiet and more elusive, never having another experience like that. Even in fact, up to this year, 2020, when I went back in September, nothing. No sounds, nothing strange happening. It's as if they just disappeared and vanished. Anyhow, I don't have any answers. What could I have experienced? I can't help but think of the idea of a Bigfoot, but I know nothing of Sasquatch and Bigfoot, so I thought I would write this out to you and see if you can answer these questions for me. Not my story, but actually my father's, so I apologize in advance if this isn't very long. This is just my recollection of the story he had told me over the years. He passed away back in 2011 from bone cancer. God rest his soul. Back in the day, we used to live out in Colorado, and he was a pretty rugged mountain man. Hiked, camped, and hunted a lot. Well, he told me as I got older that one time, while tracking down a big buck, he nearly lost his life, as he was almost attacked by something worse than a bear. He fully believed in other things of the forest, like fairies, Bigfoot, and other creatures that aren't supposed to exist. He claims he had personal one-on-one run-ins with each of these creatures at least some point in his life. Now, his story is to me that he had apparently came into the territory of one of these creatures, and that a very aggressive Bigfoot clan sought out to attack him and kill him. Luckily, they only partly injured him and left him alive. Why, he's not exactly sure, but he said they appeared merciful and primarily just wanted him out of their territory. Unfortunately for my father, the buck he was tracking down had come across a portion of their territory in the mountains. He had not known about this at the time. Since entering their territory, they acted extremely hostile towards him, circling him and coming in at him, throwing rocks, pieces of wood, all sorts of stuff, until one of them actually came up to him, grabbed him, and nearly broke his legs. Although he said they didn't, because there was some sort of restraint. Like I said, that he had told me, he believes they were merciful, and they just wanted to instill fear and aggression, and not actually kill him. This obviously left my father very fearful, traumatized for a while. He had a hard time going back into the woods, and his legs were actually injured for quite some time afterwards. He never went into detail what they did to him, or how they injured his legs, but he said they used great strength to hurt him. Even though his legs were not actually broken, they were fractured and splintered in several places along his shin, his knee, and his thigh. I don't know if they grabbed him and squeezed his legs, nor do I know if they used some sort of rock and crushed him. He wouldn't go into detail, probably as to not scare me as a young boy. But after a few months, maybe 5 or so, he was completely better and walking again as normal, and not having this odd limp that he used to have. He also never did track down that buck, since after it went into that territory, he never found it. What he believes is that since that buck came into their territory, they pursued the buck, and then noticed he was also pursuing what they thought was their kill, which is why he was targeted. Although I'm not 100% sure, but my dad isn't a liar, and he's pretty stern and serious about his stories and his tales of hunting and time out in the woods. So I believe him, even though I don't believe in Bigfoot or any of the other stories that surround it. My dad's stories, if he could tell them to you face to face, are pretty terrifying, to say the least. Anyway, I just wanted to send this to you. I thought you might find it interesting. Sorry I can't recall more, but this should be enough to get my point across.